안녕하세요. 여러분의 한국어 선생님 고빌리입니다. Years ago, I made a video called The Best Way to Learn Korean Vocabulary, and I talked about where to find vocabulary, how to practice it, and how many words you should be studying. But that video is now over 5 years old, and since then, well, some things have changed. And I think it's time for an update, because I now have some even newer tips for how you can learn vocabulary, as well as some new tools. But before I tell you about all of that, first let me introduce the sponsor of this video, you. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters and channel members. It's thanks to you that I can create this sort of content, and if you'd like to help support me to make more videos, I will leave a link to how you can do that in the description below. So let's get right into the video, starting with how you can find vocabulary. Now, one of the most obvious places that you'll find vocabulary is in your regular lessons, your curriculum, such as a textbook. Maybe you even have one of my Korean Made Simple books. However, most of the vocabulary that you'll find in lessons and books is specific to those lessons and books. For example, if you're learning about how to introduce yourself, all of the vocabulary within that chapter will be related to things that you would say when you do that. So you would learn words like 이름, meaning name, or maybe the verb 반갑다, or the expressions 반갑습니다 and 반가워요, which can mean nice to meet you. And while you should definitely learn whatever words are related to your lesson, it's often not enough. Maybe there's a word that you're hearing used all the time. For example, the word 되게, which means really. But because that word is slang, it's probably not going to appear in any beginner lesson. So here's what I recommend. Carry around a small notepad and write down words that you hear used often, no matter what those words are. For example, you might often hear the expression 사실, meaning actually, or 진짜, meaning really, or polite expressions like 고마워요 for thank you. Now, there might be words which are used often which you won't find useful yet, so you don't have to memorize everything that you hear. But once you've already learned the basic vocabulary words from your regular lessons, focus your extra time on memorizing these common words, because these will be the words which actually get used often when speaking and will be helpful to you at any level. And the best way to gather these sorts of words will be from real conversations. Preferably from listening to a Korean speak, but also it's fine to learn them from variety shows, listening to podcasts, or watching YouTube channels. Just whatever you use, I recommend something with subtitles in Korean so that you can also make sure you've written down the word correctly. When I was a beginner, all the time I'd write down a word that I heard, but somehow I'd spell it wrong. For example, someone would tell me about a 잔치, meaning like a party, but I wrote it down as 전치, which means a full recovery, and I replied, 축하해요, congratulations. And they stared at me like, what? So write down words that you hear used often, but only focus on memorizing the ones that you feel confident about. Now, I should also say something about what are known as frequency lists, because I often get questions about these too. A frequency list is just a list of the most frequently used Korean words organized by most common to least common. And many frequency lists you can find for free will include thousands of words. So in theory, it sounds like the perfect tool to use for using new vocabulary, but there's one big problem, and that's context. Because most of these words are presented without anything other than a definition, or sometimes multiple definitions, and a single example sentence. But in Korean, many words can have not only more than one meaning, but also multiple nuances, and often none of that will be included in these sorts of frequency lists. For example, the verb 짜다, meaning salty, can also be used as an action verb, meaning to squeeze something, or it can be used to describe a person as stingy. Also, many words in Korean can have the exact same or similar English translations, and frequency lists will provide no explanation for how or when to use each of these words. For example, you might learn the verbs 선택하다, 택하다, 고르다, 뽑다, and 추리다, and those all translate to choose or to select, but without any context, learning those words can be almost useless to a beginner. But instead, when you learn words on your own through exposure and through studying them, you'll be able to tell the differences from the context. So instead of focusing on all of the most common words right now, first focus on just the ones that you yourself are actually hearing and seeing used the most often. Now, this doesn't mean that frequency lists are useless. In fact, not at all. I'd say you should definitely use one as an additional source for finding vocabulary. Just don't rely completely on a list for finding new vocabulary words for the reasons that I mentioned. Because overall, the best list will be the one that you have made yourself, since those are the ones you're actually encountering, and those will be more immediately useful to you, as well as they'll have more context. Now, next, let's talk about how to practice that new vocabulary. If you're a beginner, I actually recommend using just flashcards, paper flashcards. I know it's a bit old school, but the act of writing down the word and then reading that out loud is surprisingly effective in helping you memorize words. And it works like this. Write down each word slowly and watch yourself as you write it. Then read the word out loud and repeat for the other side. Later, when you review your flashcards, read each word again out loud, as well as its definition. And while all of this takes extra time at first, it'll actually end up saving you a lot of time because all of these extra steps will just help the word to stick in your mind much more effectively. But flashcards aren't for everyone, and one reason that I wouldn't recommend flashcards is due to the absolutely massive pile of cards that you're eventually going to need once you start entering the intermediate level. But for a beginner with just a few dozen or a few hundred words, I really recommend flashcards. Now, say you're not a new beginner, then here's what I'd recommend. Anki. Just get Anki, it's free. Anki is a free program for Windows, Mac, and Linux that will help you to organize and more effectively study vocabulary. I should note though that while Anki is free on nearly every platform, as well as currently on Android, on Apple's mobile devices, it is a paid app. Now, Anki is essentially digital flashcards, and it's digital, so there's no limit to how many words you can add, or even what you want to put on each flashcard. For example, you can put example sentences, images, audio files, special formatting, create multiple decks, pretty much everything that you would ever need, and you can even share your vocabulary decks with other people and download pre-made decks from others as well. And also, if there's a feature that you need but it doesn't have, there are even plugins that you can download for Anki to further extend its usefulness. And if you stick around to the end of this video, I'll also let you know where you can download my personal Anki deck that I now use every single day, which has close to 4,000 vocabulary words, most of which though are higher level. Okay, so that leads us to the next part of this video, and that's exactly how to review vocabulary, and I'm going to be showing you by using my actual vocabulary decks within Anki. Okay, so first let's just go over what it's like to add a word to a vocabulary deck. So I'm going to use my deck, which is just called Daily Vocab, where I put everything that's not from a specific source. You can see I also have a few other decks for specific books that I was using. And if you don't have a deck yet, you can just push Create Deck here at the bottom, put a title in, leave everything else on default. So open up the deck and then click on Add at the top. Now it gives you a lot of options here, you can see, but you can just ignore all of them for now except for the section that says front and back. For the front, I like to write the Korean word here, and then I'll write the definition on the back, but it doesn't really matter because it's going to quiz you going both ways. So for an example, let's just add a simple word here, 행복, meaning happiness. And then we put happiness here at the bottom, and we are done. Yeah, if you're a beginner, keep it simple because you can always add more later and you can always learn more and more about any word. But if you want to future-proof your vocabulary deck or you're no longer a beginner, then just keep going. I also like to add the hanja for any word that has it. And if you search on Naver Dictionary, you'll also see hanja listed next to any word, so we could copy that in here too. And if you want now, you could also attach an image or an audio file to the top or even a video file. It's up to you. And I actually made a separate video all about how you can use Naver Dictionary to do all of those things, which I will link in the description below. Now, you can use Naver as well to find example sentences, and you can add those to the flashcards, preferably to the same side as the Korean word. And personally, I also like to add the Korean definitions along with the English definitions, and I recommend that you do that too if you're at least at the intermediate level or higher. So I'm gonna do that as well on this card. Okay, the next thing that you should be doing if you don't already have an example sentence in here ready to go is to make an example sentence using this word. Now, you don't actually need to add it to your vocabulary deck if it's one that you made up because there is a chance it won't be correct, but still you should be making an example sentence for every single word that you're adding. You can just say something simple out loud to yourself. No one else has to hear it, but you wanna do this because if you're adding a word that you simply don't know how to use, that word will become completely useless to you. Now, if you can't think of an example sentence to make, then you can, of course, check on Naver or ask a Korean friend to help. And finally, I also recommend writing down the usage of any words that aren't obvious. For example, if a word is always used with a specific marker or particle, write that down to help you remember. It can also be helpful to note the type of word it is. So action verb or descriptive verb, adverb, etc. For example, the verb 필요하다, while it translates as to need something, it's actually a descriptive verb, so it's therefore not used with the object marker. So let me show you an example here, one of my own words, 눈을 질끈 감다, which means to shut your eyes tight. Now you can see that I've also marked the object marker in parentheses, meaning that it's optional, and I've even included the pronunciation of the verb 감다. Next to that, I also have a full example sentence with this expression. This was one that I had found from, I think it was a game. 나는 눈을 질끈 감았다가 마음의 준비를 하며 다시 천천히 눈을 떴다. So I shut my eyes tight, prepared myself, and then slowly opened my eyes. And in fact, once I just read this example sentence, I could just guess the meaning of this word without even having to see the English translation. So that's why having example sentences can make all the difference. Okay, so that now brings us to the next tip that I have, and that's don't let your vocabulary deck become bloated. Since these are digital flashcards, you might think that having more words will be useful, but a larger vocabulary deck is only more useful if you're able to use all of those extra words. So don't be afraid to just trim out words that you don't find very useful and skip adding words that you couldn't imagine yourself hearing frequently or using yourself. Because you could create a deck with thousands of words like medulla oblongata or mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, but never even get to use them once. And while you might find advanced vocabulary like that in my personal Anki deck, you will, I wouldn't recommend that new beginners add all of those to their own decks. Okay, the next tip that I have is to set realistic vocabulary review goals. So decide how many words you want to learn a day. I'd recommend somewhere between 5 and 15. And if your goal is to have simple conversations in Korean, you really don't need as many words as you might think. In fact, just around 3,000 to 5,000 words should be enough for common conversation topics. So take 3,000, divide by 5 a day, and you get 600 days or less than 2 years to review all of those. And if you did 10 words a day, then that number gets cut in half. And I can show you what I have set up in my options actually. So if you click on the little gear here, you can see what mine are. I just have mine set to 5 new cards per day. And that might seem really low, but remember that you also have to review every single word that you've already learned on top of new ones. So I set the daily new amount of cards to reduce how much time I have to spend per day. Now, during periods where I would be spending more of my time just focusing on vocabulary, such as when I get a brand new book, I would set this more toward 15 or 20. Now, for maximum reviews, which is the next option, leave that at the default. You don't really want a maximum actually, because then words can just keep building up and you won't actually ever reach that. So it's there just to prevent you from getting overwhelmed. Since I've timed my reviews to be quick, I make sure to do one every single day. In fact, I have it as an event on my calendar for every single day. And if I were to miss a day due to traveling or something, it's okay, but then it'll build up quickly for the next day. So I try not to miss any days whenever possible. One more option though that I do think you might want to change is the Leech option. Leech cards are cards that Anki detects that you continuously get wrong, and it's designed to help you avoid wasting your time on words that you're not able to use or really advanced words. So if you're a beginner, maybe leave that as is, but for myself, I actually want to know every single word in my vocabulary deck, or else I would just delete the card in the first place, so I disabled that feature. And the rest of these settings you can also leave alone as well. So let's just do a quick review then and see how we're doing. And if you're actually interested in getting this deck that you see right here, I will include a link to it on my Patreon page in the description below. Now, since this is actually my own deck, it's not just various beginner and intermediate vocabulary that I wanted to include or that I put in a long time ago. It also has a large amount of advanced vocabulary, plenty of slang and internet words that I picked up over the years, and a hefty amount of high-level expressions. Everything though was hand-selected and added by myself, and everything is potentially useful. And while I've been making this deck now for over a decade, I only began organizing it a few years ago, so I still occasionally do updates. And if you're planning on using it, I recommend picking out words that match with your level. So if you're a beginner, focus then just on some of the expressions and some of the more simple vocabulary words that catch your eye. And if you're a fellow advanced learner, then I think there's really a lot of fun stuff that you'll find in here. Okay, so let's just do a quick review. I'm just going to click on the deck that I want, which is daily vocabulary. Notice that it'll show me, if I click study now, it'll show me only one side of the card. So I'll say the answer out loud. This is quietly and quickly, like when you're passing by someone. Then you click show answer. Now, if this word was super easy, barely an inconvenience for me, then I would just select the easy option. And it was. And that will make it take a longer time before it'll show me that word again. For most of these words, I'll just push good if I got it. But for some words, if I have to stress a bit to remember them, then I will select hard. Now, hard doesn't mean that the time gets reset, but the next time that I'll see it again will be a bit sooner, which will help me to remember it better. Now, if I completely missed a word or I just forgot what it meant, then I can press again. Now, that doesn't completely reset the timer to 0, but it basically brings it back to 1 day. So after you get it correct now, then you're going to see it again tomorrow. If you make a mistake and you press the wrong one, you can always, of course, just press the undo button here. So let's push again, but then, oops, I messed up. So let's undo. And on the mobile app, there's also an option right on the corner to do that. So I've undone that, and now I can press the select answer, which is good. And that's all there is to just reviewing words. But I want to talk for a second about something known as pride. Because when you're reviewing vocabulary, it's common to feel pride about what words you do and don't know, especially for your own vocabulary deck. For example, if I were to review the word 행복, meaning happiness, and I got it wrong, I might feel like I want to push hard instead of again, just because I feel like I should know that word, right? But if you really can't remember a word, even if you had it perfect a year ago, don't feel bad about pressing again and just starting over, because keep in mind that your vocabulary review is for only you. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, and nobody's watching you review, except in my case where I'm showing you my review process and my entire vocabulary deck on Patreon. But the most important thing is that you know the word and not that you never miss a word. And I also will commonly have to press again on difficult words that I otherwise wouldn't need to review for months. And while it does feel a bit annoying to have to start from the beginning again for that word, it's a very small percentage of the words that you're learning. Now, I do a review every single day like this, and it only takes me about 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes max, which makes it possible for me to do it every single day, even when I'm really busy. Okay, before I finish this video, I should also mention two other resources, Memrise and Quizlet, which are websites you can also use to review flashcards. I personally don't use either. I think Anki is simpler and has more features and is therefore better. But if you're using those and enjoy them, I wouldn't bother changing it. And that's it. How are you finding and reviewing vocabulary words? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more lessons, and I'll see you again next time. 그럼 다음에 또 봐!